Motivated in part by a desire to have sweet potatoes with our Sunday night dinner, and in part by a need to get these two raised beds here prepped for planting of fall crops, I decided to go ahead and harvest a little earlier than I initially intended. I figure the tubers aren't going to get any appreciably bigger in the next 2 or 3 weeks, and also curiosity was really getting the better of me, and I wanted to see how these did over the summer. Before getting to the good stuff, I just want to give a quick background on how these plants came about. I started these from tubers purchased at a local grocery store in early April. I'm not going to go into too much detail on how to start sweet potatoes from grocery store purchased tubers. There's a lot of tutorials on this on the internet and YouTube. It's really mostly a matter of burying a sweet potato halfway in a shallow dish of soil, keeping it watered, and waiting for sprouts to emerge. And then when the sprouts are big enough, you propagate them and plant them. Um, it's important. The one important thing to remember is that you want to purchase your starter tubers from the organic section of the store. The reason being that sometimes commercially available tubers are sprayed first with a sprout inhibitor to improve shelf life, and that can obviously cause problems if you're intending to start a larger crop. So buy organic, sink them in a shallow dish of water, keep them damp in a sunny spot or under grow lights, and before you know it, your sweet potato tuber will sprout plenty of slips, is what they're called. Put those slips in a jar of water until they sprout adequate roots, and then you can pop them in the ground. As a first step, I'm just getting the greenery out of the way. Sweet potato leaves are actually edible and delicious, but I'm kind of burnt out on food preservation, so I am just going to feed those to our chickens. Next, I'm getting some of the mulch off the surface of the bed. Uh, Accidentally tilling in too many wood chips can tie up nitrogen. That's not the best, so I'm scraping as much off as I can before getting to work with the pitchfork. All right, this is an encouraging sign. I know that I'm going to at least get some decent sized tubers out of this bed. This is somewhat of a surprise. I knew these tubers were good size just by looking at the tops of them, but I was not expecting anything quite this huge. I hope that these are actually good to eat. Sometimes root veggies, when they get too big, they can get fibrous, kind of like, chewing on a boiled stick. So we'll see when it comes time to cut these up or process them down if they're not all woody and inedible. But wow, these are huge. Moving on to the second bed where I planted a more traditional red skin orange flesh variety, I'm noticing the tubers aren't quite as big. However, they're still plenty beefy. These are about the size of what I typically encounter for sale in local grocery stores, so no complaints there. Interestingly, I've noticed that the biggest clusters of the biggest potatoes are centered around where I planted the starter tuber itself. So after I cut my slips off and propagated those, I just decided to stick the remainder of the sweet potato from which they originated in the ground, and that is where the bulk of the production seems to be. I think I'm probably going to keep that little factoid in mind for next year's planting of sweet potatoes, and maybe just plant sprouted tubers and see what happens. All right, now it's time to break out the garden fork and round up any stragglers that weren't pulled up in those initial clusters. And here are the two largest sweet potatoes of the day. The one on the left weighed in at about 3 pounds, the one on the right at about 2 pounds. Not too shabby for just a few square feet of grocery store sweet potatoes. Here's everything all together. In total, I got 35 pounds of sweet potatoes out of those two beds. And keep in mind, that was only half of each bed, so a total of 18 square feet. A potential minor issue that I've noticed is pest damage on some of the tubers. A number of these tubers were eaten into by some kind of pest, which resulted in these perfectly round little burrows going into many of these. I'm not too concerned. It's no big deal to cut around this when I'm preparing these to eat. However, I am somewhat concerned that it might reduce shelf life. So, as burnt out on food preservation as I am, I'm probably going to have to can and freeze a number of these to make sure that they last and don't spoil. But that's part of the game. Thanks again for watching. Stay tuned. I've got a lot more coming up.